Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to D.G. Wills Books in La Jolla, California. This afternoon, we're delighted to have Senator Byron L. Dorgan, who will discuss his book, The Girl in the Photograph, the true story of a Native American child lost and found in America. Senator Dorgan served as a U.S. Congressman and Senator from North Dakota for 30 years. He was chairman of the Senate committees and subcommittees on the issues of energy, aviation, appropriations, water policy, and Indian affairs. He created the Center for Native American Youth to work on teen suicide prevention, education opportunity, and more for children living on Indian reservations. Through the story of Tamara, an abused Native American child, Senator Dorgan describes the plight of many children living on reservations and offers hope for the future. On a winter morning in 1990, he picked up the Bismarck Tribune. On the front page, a small American girl gazed into the distance, shedding a tear. The headline, "Foster Home Children Beaten and Nobody's Helping." Dorgan, who had been working with American Indian tribes to secure resources, was upset. He flew to the Standing Rock Indian Reservation to meet with 5-year-old Tamara, who had suffered a horrible beating at a foster home. He visited with Tamara and her grandfather, and they became friends. But then Tamara disappeared. He would search for her for decades until finally they found each other again. This is her story from childhood to the present, but it's also the story of a people and a nation. More than 1 in 3 American Indian Alaskan Native children live in poverty. Many are disproportionately in foster care and awaiting adoption. Senator Dorgan, who founded the Center for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute, has worked tirelessly to bring Native youth voices to the forefront of policy discussions, engage Native youth in leadership and advocacy, and secure and share resources for Native youth. Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell has said of this book, Senator Dorgan describes the nearly 2 centuries of shameful treatment of American Indians, much of which continues today. And Senator Heidi Heitkamp has said, The Girl in the Photograph is one of the most important civil rights books written in this century. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Byron L. Dorgan.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, Dennis, thank you very much. I admire Dennis. I've had the opportunity to come to this bookstore a number of times in recent years, and I don't know, he ought to have to pay to be around all these books. You know, he probably does, but it's a wonderful thing to see this bookstore on the streets of La Jolla. And thank you, Dennis, for what you've done to invite people to come to hear a few thoughts about this book titled The Girl in the Photograph. Let me tell you a little more about that story, and then we'll talk about the larger portions of the book, and then we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. The larger story is that on February 4th, 1990, I did see this story. The story was about this beautiful young child, Native American child, taken from her parents and put in a foster home. The person that was making sure that children were placed in the right area was taking 125 cases. Well, the standard is about 25 cases. She was taking 125 cases to try and determine where you put a child. She put this child in a foster home. Hadn't checked it out really, you know, at least you wouldn't have checked it out much given the time she had. And so at a foster home, at a drunken party on a Saturday night, a 2-year-old child was beaten severely. She had her nose broken, her leg broken, her arm broken, her hair pulled out at the roots, and then lay in an empty room for several days with no medical attention. And that's the start of Tamara's life. Age 2, the horrific beating. I saw the story in the Bismarck Tribune February 4th, 1990, 2.5 years later, after that beating occurred, and the story talked about the abuse of children in foster homes, especially on Indian reservations. So I traveled to the reservation that weekend when I was back in North Dakota from Washington, D.C., met with Reginald Birdhorse, her grandfather, and Tamara was sitting on his lap, staring sort of vacantly, and didn't seem to believe or understand. There was other people in the room, and she then disappeared. I sent her 2 Christmas gifts and to her grandfather's address. Her grandfather died And then I never again saw Tamara. I would ask, when I'd go to the reservation, the Indian reservation, I would ask people, do you know what happened to that little girl that was so horrifically beaten? No one had heard of her. No one. And 27 years later, I got an email. And the email was from someone named Tamara. I opened the email and discovered it was in fact that little girl, now 33 years old, living in Minneapolis, but homeless. She sent me an email, and let me tell you how she found me. As a homeless person, she went to a library, a public library, used a computer, and found a way to do a search because she had PTSD. She had no knowledge of her youth, couldn't have any memory of what had happened to her, and she just wanted to find out, why am I this way? And she did a search. And her search with this computer at the library discovered for her that I had given a speech about her on the floor of the United States Senate and used her name. And that became the basis of her understanding what had happened to her. I told her story briefly, along with the story of others, when I spoke in the United States Senate about Indian children being abused in foster homes. And so Tamara sent me an email. As I told you, she was homeless in Minneapolis. She had a very, very difficult life. And I went to Minneapolis very quickly on the way home to North Dakota, and stopped and met with Tamara. And I've spent a lot of time with Tamara now, these recent couple of years as I was writing this book. And in the first email to me, she said to me, after she discovered the story I had told about her in the United States Senate, she said, if telling my story has helped other Indian children, I'm happy that you've done that. And as a result of her saying that, I, in meeting with her, talked with her about maybe doing a story about what she had been through. And maybe that story can be instructive to others or give hope to others who are living in the shadows and having great difficulty. And so the result is this book. Tamara is no longer homeless, I should tell you. Her health has improved. She lives with someone who is special in her life. She has some income, but she still suffers from PTSD. She still suffers from what happened to her at age 2. And she will perhaps carry that burden for much of her life. It's just one of those things that happened to her that she can't undo. But let me tell you that this story is a story in which I tracked down a couple people that probably saved Tamara's life. I tracked down a man named Ronald Russell, and Tamara told me about him, and he was an Uber driver in Minneapolis, St. Paul area. He also worked at a nightclub managing the restrooms and the cleaning of restrooms and so on. I tried to track him down for a year, and I finally got him. And here's what I discovered. He was a man who belonged to a church who cared a lot about homeless people, and he would always keep his eye out for people who appeared homeless and having difficulty. He saw Tamara on the street, and he stopped and talked to Tamara. And he asked her if she needed a job, if he could help her with a job. She said she would be interested in that, and so he went out and purchased some clothes for her, because if you're homeless, you don't, and living under a bridge, for example, right? You don't have clothes to wear to work. So anyway, she was at work at a nightclub called 7 in Minneapolis, and she was tending the women's bathroom. She was an attendant, cleaning up when people got sick, putting cigarettes and perfume out and so on. That was what she did. Did it for about a month. It was hard for her to work, so she didn't ever find a job that lasted any length of time. But it was late at night, and Ronald Russell said to her, I'm worried, we're working late, I'm worried about you walking alone on the streets of Minneapolis tonight. I want to give you a ride home. She said, no, that's fine, that's fine. He said, no, I'm worried, I want to give you a ride home. Don't want to do that, she said. He finally coerced her into getting in the car, and he's going to give her a ride home. And as they're driving, he said, where is it? And she said, well, right now I'm living under a bridge. And he said, I'm not taking you to a bridge. He said, "I'm taking you to the Salvation Army." She said, "Well, I won't go in." He said, "Well, then it'll be a very long night, because we're going to pull up in front of the Salvation Army, and I'm not leaving till I see you walk through the door." He probably doesn't know he saved her life. I told him in the phone conversation when I finally tracked him down and interviewed him, but he probably saved Tamara's life. She walked through that door. She was there for a year and a half at the Salvation Army shelter. And that is what helped begin to find her footing. And Tamara is a remarkable young woman. I want to say to you, she's now just turned 35, as a matter of fact. I've talked to Tamara for so many hours. And she is not someone who's had substantial education. I've never heard her misuse a verb, for example, just as an example. She is smart and capable, and yet she suffers from PTSD and other things. And so by the way, she's studying, she has a great acuity for language, and she's studying Japanese, and she's also studying the Korean language. And so this is a remarkable young woman who carries this burden, and as a result has great difficulty navigating to the kind of jobs or the kind of opportunities that we would do perhaps. But this book is a tribute to her. And this book, I believe, will help other young Native American children. And I want the book to be a tribute to a young Native American who I think has great courage, resilience, and an ability to survive, because boy, she's been through a lot. Now let me talk just a little more generally, just for a couple of minutes, about Native Americans. I come from a really tiny town, by the way, a town of 300 people in southwestern North Dakota. I was in the top 5 of a high school class of 9. I was way up there, and tiny little class. And I found my way, and I was very lucky, and I found my way to get to the United States Congress and spend 30 years there and so on. But my dad lost both of his parents very, very early, and he was in 6th grade when he didn't have parents, and he had to support all of his brothers and sisters, and he quit school, and he, among other things, herded horses on the Indian reservation, and that gave him a love of horses. The rest of his life, he loved horses, but he also loved what he learned on the 3 affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara reservation. And so as a young boy, my father took me to the tribes, took me up to the affiliated tribes, and taught me a bit about their culture, introduced me to his friends. And then as just a young boy, I became interested in Native Americans and tried to understand what is this, and how does that integrate into what we all do? And the answer is not very well, as you know. What has happened to Native Americans over a couple of centuries is one of the great stains in our country. One of them is slavery, and the other is the treatment of Native Americans. Very few people know the history of all of these things. It's just a fact that the day after Christmas in 1862, the largest mass execution in America occurred. 38 Native Americans were marched to the gallows and hung till dead. 38. It was part of the uprising, the Minnesota uprising. And that uprising occurred because, very much like other tribes, these proud Native Americans who were here first, the first Americans, discovered that the land they had and the capability they had to sustain themselves kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And then ultimately, members of their tribe were starving. And there was violence on both sides. You become violent when you're starving. And as a result of the Minnesota uprising, 38 Native Americans were taken to the gallows. But it's not just the Minnesota uprising. It's Wounded Knee. It's the Trail of Tears. It's Killdeer Mountain. I could just recite the examples of what has happened to Native Americans. And much of it's in this book. But in addition to that in this book, I also have a couple of other things. I have some things that inspire people about what's happening on Indian reservations today as well. Yes, there is relentless, gripping poverty. There's no question about that. And if any of us live in that relentless, gripping poverty, we bear the consequences of it. We suffer from it. Let me just read to you, if I might, a couple of pieces of information about that kind of poverty, because too many people just don't understand it. If you need specifics, quoting now, take for example a snapshot of the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, a reservation with major challenges. Unemployment hovers around 80%, with a median income of $4,000. No, the editors haven't missed a zero, $4,000. The median household income in America was $55,000. Alcoholism is a pandemic in Pine Ridge. Many babies suffer from fetal alcohol syndrome. Infant mortality is 5 times the national average. All of this despite the fact that the sale and consumption of alcohol is prohibited by tribal law. Liquor stores are just 1 mile outside of the border of the reservation in Nebraska, doing a booming business. Teen suicide, 4 times the national average. Life expectancy is 48 years for men, 48 years for men on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and 52 years for women, lower than only that of Haiti. School dropout is over 70%, while teacher turnover is 8 times the national average. Gang violence permeate the shadows. Law enforcement is outmanned and underfunded. I mean, I'm telling you that just because I want us all to be rather angry about what has happened to those who were here first. In this book, I've included some stories about a generation of leaders who have tried valiantly to change these things, but they don't have enough tools to make those changes, unfortunately. I've also told some stories that are unbelievably inspiring stories about some young Native Americans. I'm telling you about Tamra, who bears the consequences of this horrible beating, but I'm also wanting this book to tell you there are some other young Native Americans out there that are doing things that will just make you feel so proud. Dakota Brown. Dakota is studying at Stanford now, by the way. Dakota Brown. He was a young kid, Native American kid, about 14 years old or so, and he's playing on the football team. And he saw his buddies, who he knew were capable, but they were failing and going to be kicked off the team. Couldn't keep their grades up. And Dakota Brown said to his best friend, who was the star of the football team, who was about to lose his opportunity to play football, and Dakota wanted him to play football, obviously, playing alongside him. Dakota said, "You know what? I will stay after school an hour a night, every night, if you will stay with me in order to catch up and keep up with our studies. You can do this." And that was the start. An organization that he and his football buddy decided to call NERDS, Native Education Raising Dedicated Students. And guess what? Others started understanding what they were doing, and they joined. And then on the football team, these young players that were getting C's and D's and sometimes F's, all of a sudden were getting B's, B plus and B minus and C pluses, and passing their grades. And the youngest girl that started was an 8th grader. And she was so taken with this organization called NERDS that she got involved and did their logo and everything. And by the way, she was considered a slow learner, and she was failing in class. She just graduated high school with a 4.0 grade point average. Is that amazing? And you talk about an inspiring story. Then Dakota Brown took this to 3 other schools. So the reason I wanted to just tell you that story, and there are lots of other stories like it in this book, I want you to feel that there's some hope as well, that there are answers and there are solutions and there are opportunities for us to decide those who were here first deserve some attention by us to try to figure out how can they become, at long last, full participants in this American dream. And so that is what resulted in this book. It's my 5th book. It was the hardest to write, just because I didn't want this book, and I could have a book with 400 pages so filled with atrocities, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have a book that would explain the circumstances, but also give us a feeling that we can do more. I want to tell you about one more person I've written about in the book, and her name is Eloise Cobell. She's from the Blackfeet Nation. Eloise, I loved Eloise. She was quite remarkable. She discovered that the federal government was cheating Native Americans with all their trust accounts. You know, it was the case that Indian land and Indian assets, including energy and you name it, go into a trust account in the Interior Department to be managed by the U.S. Department of the Interior. But in fact, they have not managed them. There has been mass stealing and theft and incompetence, and they couldn't even reconstruct the records. And Eloise used to tell the stories, and she'd go and testify before Senate hearings. And then she finally sued the federal government. I mean, she talked about the impoverished old lady in her late 80s who would look out of her window of a little tar paper type shack and see oil wells in her yard, on her land, and she didn't get a penny from it. Not a penny. She lived in abject poverty. I mean, that's the kind of thing that was going on with the special trustees and so on who were supposed to manage these trust accounts for Native Americans. So Eloise sued the federal government. The suit, and you talk about somebody with guts, that was Eloise. And she pursued that suit for 15 years. And she won $3 billion from the federal government. Died of cancer before the money was paid out. It wasn't hers. I mean, the money was going to go to the larger group of Native Americans, and does and still goes now. But Eloise died prior to the payout. And just to tell you one more thing you wouldn't know about Eloise Cobell, she was also this wonderful Native American woman. She was also the president of the Elvis Presley Fan Club of Montana. And as she lie in state in the gymnasium on the Blackfeet Nation, they played Elvis Presley music. So God bless her memory. I've written about her in this book as well. All right, I spoke much longer than I intended to, and I'm sorry about that. But let me see if you have some questions or thoughts or opportunities
Senator,
to weigh in.
Question.
Yes, sir.
I was going to ask you about Eloisa Cobell, but in lieu of that, I will ask, having learned that you mentioned that Native Americans were not allowed to vote until 1924.
That's correct.
Are Native Americans allowed to vote if they have a P.O. box? Because instead of a street address? Because I know that was
not in North Dakota. You know what? It is the case these days, and by the way, this is a broader issue, but it's especially an issue related to Native Americans. They were the last people to get the vote in this country. Women, of course, got the vote in 1919. So for the first half of America, the first half of our existence, women were told, you don't really count. But, you know, God bless those courageous women, Lucy Burns and Alice Paul and others who were rounded up and darn near killed in the brutal detention at the Occoquan prison. I won't tell those stories, but the fact is, women got the right to vote because they demonstrated for it and they risked their lives for it. Native Americans were the last people to get the right to vote, 1924, and the fact is there were some states that still wouldn't give them the right to vote until the late 1940s. It's just unbelievable to me when you think about this. These are people who were here first, and you know, Edward Winslow was a guy he came over on the Mayflower, right? He was in charge of, you know, getting over here on the Mayflower, and so they landed at Plymouth, and so the Indians met them. By the way, we probably ought to take some lessons about how you treat immigrants, because the Indians met the people that came off the Mayflower and welcomed them. And they taught them how to farm and taught them how to harvest. And at the end of the first year, out of 24 married women who were on the Mayflower, only 4 survived the winter. But you know what? Even though they had that harsh winter, they still got some crops, and then they had a feast. And it was the Indians and the Puritans and others from the Mayflower who together feasted, at least that they had survived at that point. And so Indians Native Americans, by the way, could teach other people in this country a little something about welcoming immigrants, couldn't they?
And a generation later, they beheaded the chief.
They did. They did. And That's part. I've not written about that, but those stories of what happened subsequently, and by the way, one of them they sold into slavery in Spain, one of those Native Americans. But so yeah, the right to vote. I'm sorry, I've taken too long to answer that question as well. But the right to vote is so important, and to tell those who were here first, you get to be last in terms of being given the right to vote. It's outrageous. So now I've gotten rid of some of the outrage. Yes, sir. The chief.
The senator was just talking about is the fallout of genocide that happened to Native Americans, and it goes from the memories. There's this fairly new science called epigenetics, where one can actually be able to feel trauma of the past. And I imagine also good things too. And it's subconscious because you don't know what's going on. And so through intergenerational trauma, it goes from one generation to another. I mean, it's so difficult, as you know. That's why your sons and daughters are just like you, because they're in the house eating dinner every day and speaking, talking, and you've influenced them.
Chief, I want to quote Joseph Marshall, a Lakota Indian historian, and because it comes to the cultural trauma issue and so on, and responsibility. So Joseph Marshall is speaking at the University of Colorado at a commencement kind of thing, and someone in the crowd, as Joseph Marshall was talking, raised his hand and he said, "Wasn't all that about your ancestors and my ancestors? So why am I held responsible for this?" And Joseph Marshall said, "Because you know the story. And once you know the story about injustice, you have a responsibility to fix it. Because you know the story." And so cultural trauma is very real. I mean, I've written about that in this book as well. Manifest destiny, the notion of manifest destiny is very real as well. Now I want to tell you one other thing. I am a non-Native American writing a book about Native Americans, and some might take umbrage at that, but I'm a Native American. I have a Native American name given me by the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. It's called Shante Unwiaka. Shante Unwiaka, which means thinks with his heart. And I believe with all my heart what's been done is wrong, but what's been done also has to be fixed and repaired.
Senator, are you able to repeat the question?
He's asked me about what is called issue 1, that is the issue of funding in political campaigns. And I've worked on that a lot. I mean, what is happening today, as you know, is that it's more of an auction for public service than almost anything. The Supreme Court has made a dreadful decision, and their decision was that it effectively allows almost anybody to make unlimited contributions from undisclosed sources to political candidates, and it is literally going to ruin our democracy unless we somehow find a way to fix it. Citizens United is the name of the case. The Supreme Court, in my judgment, made a horrible mistake in the way they ruled. They surely would have and should have and could have known the consequences of it. But we're seeing those play out now in the most recent years. And there's a lot of urgency to do a lot of things to try to fix what's going on in our country. Our country deserves better than we're now getting politically. But right at the top of the list is fixing Citizens United and restoring some sanity to the issue of fundraising for political campaigns. I wanted to mention that there's a chapter in this book called Defenders of the Earth, and it is about the Dakota Access Pipeline issue. And in addition to Defenders of the Earth chapter, which describes that issue, I have a piece in this book about Bobby Jean Threelegs, a young 24-year-old girl who played an interesting role in the issue of the Dakota Access Pipeline and pushing the Corps of Engineers on those issues. But I think you will find the story about Bobby Jean Threelegs unbelievably inspiring. And I think you'll find this chapter called Defenders of the Earth, which is so much of the tradition of the culture of Native Americans. I think you'll find that very interesting as well. Let me start with the last portion of this first, and that is the requirement and the need to get addresses for Native Americans in order for them to vote. The North Dakota State Legislature has done what many other state legislatures have done across this country, and that is try to prevent people from voting. When I grew up, I always thought, what we really want to do is have more people vote, right? You want to encourage voting, not discourage it. But so many have been trying to throw people off the voting rolls in various states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, to name a couple, and there are others, many others. The state of North Dakota, the state legislature decided that you can't vote unless you have a street address. Well, on Indian reservations, there are very few street addresses, and so they were just trying to because Native Americans, generally speaking, have voted Democratic, and this heavily Republican state legislature very much wanted to reduce that type of voting, and so they made it very, very difficult in the last election. Although I must say some Native American communities found ways to deal with it. But only partially successfully. We need to find a way to keep fighting against those who would prevent minorities and prevent Native Americans and prevent others from casting their vote. It's unbelievable to me that we have people still trying to do that. We ought to be encouraging voting. We ought to have voting all weekend long, right? I mean, what we're doing doesn't make much sense to me.
Divisiveness today in the Congress, Republicans don't talk to Democrats, and even Republicans don't talk to Republicans, and Democrats don't talk to Democrats if they don't agree with them. How is that going to change?
Well, the American people will have to change it somehow. I mean, this is what's called tribal politics. And the question is, are you on my side or their side, right? Are you part of our caucus or their caucus? But, it wasn't too long ago when people would say, no, I just represent the United States of America. I've come to the Congress because I want to do well for our country. And I'm a centrist or a moderate, and I'm willing to work with people on the other side. That's not happening now. And it's not happening now because those who would decide to work on the other side of the aisle will pay a significant penalty for it. They'll get a primary contest and probably lose their seat, so they don't do much of that. It's just very strange what has happened with respect to tribal politics, but it comes back to the American people in terms of what they want and what they're willing to get from someone who aspires to be a senator or a congressman. Ultimately, they have to expect people are going to do what they believe is in the best interest of our country. But these days, that is not such a surefire bet. The people I served with in the House and the Senate for 30 years are some of the most talented, creative, wonderful people I know. They love their country. And they're not angry personally with each other. That's not even the case today. They're not angry personally, but they don't. The fact is, they don't seem to be willing to come together in the middle. Now then this goes back in my judgment to the Tea Party, and the Tea Party created a circumstance some decades ago, and they said, look, the problem in this country is we got people just falling all over themselves. They're not willing to stand up for principle. You send them to Washington, they become a creature of whatever, and it's a cesspool and a mess and a swamp, as has been reused recently. And so they said, let's assume you're a campaign gathering for me, and I'm a Tea Party guy, right? So here's what I say to you. I say, I'll tell you what, I want you to send me to Washington, D.C. And if you do, we'll stop what's happening there. And you know how we're going to stop it? When it comes to the question of, do you stand by your principles or do you cave in and compromise? When I come back at the next election, you will never, ever catch me caving in and compromising. I'm going to stand by my principles, and by God, I am unmovable. Well, listen, democracy only works and has only ever worked because of the lubrication of compromise. That's the only way it works. If you feel one way and I feel a different way, and you are the most conservative member of the United States Senate, and I'm the most liberal member of the United States Senate, but you and I like each other, and I know you got there because you have some talent and you feel the same about, and so we sit down and we talk about, I can't do what you want, you can't do what I want, but let's see if we can make a little progress advancing the ball. That's called compromise. It is not something that exists today, because they don't feel like they dare go home and say to the people that they promised they wouldn't compromise, well, yeah, I made a couple compromises here so we could kind of get some traction and make a little bit of progress. And that gets back to the tribal notion of politics. And only a small number of people determine who the candidate is, right? So let's assume that candidate X is a Republican candidate. Let me use Republican as an example because that's the most prevalent approach these days. A Republican candidate, and they've decided, I'm going to compromise in these areas. And in a nanosecond, somebody says, well, that's fine. You want to be a compromiser? I'm taking you on, and I'm going to take you down. And you now have a primary fight, Mr. or Mrs. And so they're not going to toy around with that. I was with Trent Lott, former Republican leader, 3 days ago. And I reminded Trent of a call I got from him when both of us were serving in the U.S. House. Trent's a Republican from Mississippi. I'm a Democrat from North Dakota. And I had a big water project in North Dakota that's always a curse to try to pull a water project to the U.S. Congress. But Trent knew it, that I had this water project going on, and he was up in the Rules Committee because he was on the Rules Committee. And I got a telephone call from Trent Lott. I wasn't there. Trent says, Byron, they're messing with your water project in the Rules Committee. You really need to get up there and get involved. And I rushed up to the Rules Committee and got some people and talked to them and got it solved. Republican Trent Lott, he didn't need to call me. I've never forgotten it. 3 days ago I mentioned it to him. Just something you don't forget, because somebody is a Republican and a Democrat are working to help each other out. And so that's the way things should work and could work, but it's not the way things do work.
Give the example of Kennedy and Hatch working together when you and I were there.
Yeah, Kennedy and Hatch worked together a lot. They were very close, and Hatch spoke at the memorial for Teddy up in Boston. No, they were very close. And incidentally, they used to do a point-counterpoint on a radio station, as you would recall. And it would kind of act like they were kind of not happy with each other, but the fact is, personally, they liked each other and worked well together. And I should just mention impeachment to you, because I was a juror in the last impeachment trial in the Senate. And I remember the first day, we didn't have the rules of how to do the trial, just as we don't have them now. Mitch McConnell is going to he has a majority, so he has them. He's not told the Democrats what they are yet, which is rather strange. It's Saturday. It's going to happen on Tuesday. He's not consulted with them or told them what his rules are, right? Let me tell you how we did it with Trent Lott and Tom Daschle. We took 100 senators, all of us, went into the old Senate office chamber, the old one, and we had a meeting. There were 100 of us. And at the end of that meeting, you know what the solution was? It was proposed by and embraced by then 100 senators. It came from Ted Kennedy and Phil Gramm from Texas. They couldn't have been further apart philosophically, but they both stood up in that group of 100 senators and sort of created an idea and improved on it back and forth. Pretty soon we had the way through this trial that we had to hold 20 years ago. And that was bipartisan. And it was 100-0 vote when we voted on it. Fascinating.
You said you won your senatorial or congressional seat by getting 30% of the Republican vote?
20.
20%. How did you do that?
I'll just tell you my history. So I went out of state from North Dakota to get a master's degree, and I came back to meet an unbelievably inspiring guy, a guy who was from a town of 80 people in North Dakota, who graduated from Harvard Law School. And he had just won political office in North Dakota at age 38. And I was working in Colorado in the aerospace industry. I was 25 years old. And they said, you need to go talk to this guy. I was up for my grandfather's funeral. And I went and talked to him. Didn't want to, but I did. And went and talked to him, and I was so inspired. And I decided, you know what, I'm moving back from Denver, Colorado. I'm going to go to work for this guy. And so I moved back, and I went to work for this guy. And he was remarkable. And a year and a half later, I walked in his office one morning and found him dead. He'd taken his own life. And I walked in, I will never forget the shock of that moment and the sight. But it was a tragic story. And 6 weeks after he took his life, he was a statewide elected official, the governor called me down to his office. I was 26 years old, and the governor said, "I've decided I'd like to appoint you to the unexpired term of Commissioner Shosted. Would you take it?" And I said yes. And I served from age 26 in constitutional office in the state capitol, ran for election and again, and served 6 terms in the U.S. Congress and 3 terms in the U.S. Senate. And that's sort of my history. And I think most North Dakotans knew, I was there for a long time, starting at age 26. Most North Dakotans knew me. And I think the issue, until more recently, the issue has always been the answer to the question, do you know this person? Do you like this person? Do you trust this person? If the answer is I know, like, and trust this person, I'm going to vote for him. Heidi Heitkamp lost that race in North Dakota 2 years ago, year and a half ago. They knew, liked, and trusted Heidi. They just did. But it's changed. Now, when I ran 11 times statewide successfully in North Dakota, that's a lot of elections, I always had to get about a 20% of the Republican vote in order to win. And I did. And I think it's because they were not so attracted to the magnetism of their political philosophy. They just wanted to know, who are you? Do we know, like, and trust you? If they do, they're fine. Now it's become much more tribal, much more related to what party do I belong to? And that has changed politics, not just in North Dakota, it's changed it elsewhere as well.
Good afternoon, Senator. I wanted to ask you what you thought the most effective strategies are to fight the native teen suicide epidemic, and whether you think there's any national strategies, or whether it's, to the extent there are solutions, maybe it's tribe by tribe.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. Just spent last week at a meeting about Native American teen suicide. The fact is, Chief, I ran into some trouble because I held a public hearing in North Dakota on teenage suicide on reservations. And there were tribal chairmen and others who said, do not be doing this because it reflects poorly on us. I said, you know what? We cannot any longer be silent. We just cannot be silent about these young kids that feel hopeless and helpless to the point where they're going to take their own lives. We've got lots. Now, one of the problems we have is just even the issue of data. The ideation of suicide, the completion of suicide. Just getting data about what's happening is very hard. And I understand that because Indians are sovereign nations. The tribes are sovereign. So they don't have to, if you say, well, here's what we'd like, they don't always have to put their data in line the right way. But we especially need a lot of information. So let me tell you, Avis Littlewind, it just broke my heart. She was 14 years old, and she took her life. She was from the Fort Totten Indian Reservation, and she came from a circumstance where her sister committed suicide, her father committed suicide, and Avis had emotional issues and so on, and her mother was absent, was a drug abuser, and so Avis laid in bed for almost 3 months in a fetal position, then got out of bed and found something to hang herself with and took her life. And I went to the reservation when I read that. The next weekend I went there, and I tried to understand. I visited with her classmates. I visited with tribal officials. I visited with the folks who were engaged in social services, in mental health services. And I, by God, could not figure out, if I were Avis Littlewind, how could you find a way, given what happened with that family and given the circumstances, the inability to get mental health treatment, identify it and get it, let alone get to it, to borrow a car. I could not figure out how people would miss, why would they not miss a kid that's gone for 3 months, right? How could we not keep track of these kids somehow? And so I spent a lot of time on this issue of teen suicide. I wish I could tell you that the solution is obvious, to say this is not some mysterious disease for which we don't know a cure. I wish I could say that, but there's a lot at work here. And so, but we just have to keep pushing and pushing. And we're doing a lot of that at the Center for Native American Youth. I founded that for 2 reasons. One, The teen suicide issue is something we've got to begin solving, and education opportunity, because I think part of the ability to step up and out of some of these circumstances is through education. We're talking now about all the things that are wrong, right? And things we need to fix. And boy, we're just, unfortunately, there's so much discord in our country that it's hard to kind of get your arms around it all. The book Future Shock spoke of something called dizzying disorientation, an effect where things are spinning so quickly that it's almost hard to find your footing, right? That's the dizzying disorientation that exists today with all of us trying to think through how do we get out of this? How do we get to to get out of these small craft warnings to better seas, smoother sailing?
But he talked about the drug companies who would powder each side of the hill heavily with contributions, and that goes to raising money. How do you stop something like that and get something done?
Lobbying gets back to the question about issue one. I mean, I wish I had a simple answer. I mean, the fact is, every interest in America lobbies. The American Cancer Society, the churches. I mean, everybody. So lobbying should not be pejorative, but it's the lobbying that goes on with the pharmaceutical industry to keep prices way above where they should be, or a company that decides to take EpiPen and increase the price 500% in 10 years, right? I mean or insulin. I mean that stuff is almost criminal in my judgment.
Because of fracking and other hydrocarbon-based industries, our nation's trust of waters is really being violated. And what would you say would be an avenue to help impede the process of the endangerment to the entire water system of about 2/3 of the U.S.?
Well, a change in the White House would help. Obviously, what the White House has done in terms of EPA administrators is unbelievable to me. It's starting with Pruitt now. It's unbelievable what they have done to try to unwind the things that represent the regulations to protect health. And it's you see it, and you see it reported every day of this rule or that rule that is designed to try to help people and to protect people's health. And they are in wholesale quantity getting rid of those rules and regulations. So if we had someone else in the White House selecting someone to run the Environmental Protection Agency who cared about protecting the environment, really cared about protecting the environment, it would be a huge step forward.
Because this is a slow,
I don't mean to be trite about it. Yeah,
problem.
I don't mean to be trite about it, but I just that would probably be the most significant step this country could take. Now we're about at the end of our time here, and I want to again thank Dennis, but I want to leave you with one inspiring story, just because it's important to do that. I want to tell you about. And I've written about her in this book called Allison Binney, a young woman who's from California, by the way, a Native American tribe here in California. Allison Binney grew up in very substantial poverty. There was substance abuse in her family. She was a young girl that would have to walk almost any place they went because they didn't have a vehicle. They had no money. They had hand-me-down clothes. And Allison Binney, she as a young girl would walk to school, and she walked past this place that it looked like a coffee shop. And she saw this guy come out almost every single morning of that coffee shop, and he had a cup of coffee. He was dressed really nice with a suit, and he had a hat on, and he had a cup of coffee, and he had a little bag. And she watched him for years, just, this little girl. And she was like, she told me a story about, she played basketball in school as well. And the coach knew that at the end of a long basketball practice at 9 o'clock, the coach knew that her parents weren't coming from her parents weren't there, and didn't have a car in any event. But the coach would say to her, you know what, you don't have to have your parents come, let me drop you off, I'll drive you home. She knew exactly what that coach was understanding, that she just didn't have the capability, and her family didn't have the capability. And so anyway, so Allison went on, and she went to this class, and this teacher said, we want you to the students here to go interview someone that you think is successful. And Allison thought, you know what, I'm going to see if I can interview that guy who goes in that coffee shop, the guy that wears a suit. And she went and met with him. And it turns out, she as he came out of a coffee shop, she asked him, and by then she was like in 8th grade or 10th grade, and she said, could I interview you? He gave her an address, and he said yes. She went and sat down, and she began to interview him about his success. She found out he was a lawyer. And she said, tell me, what is it that you have in that bag every day from the bakery? He said, a blueberry muffin. And she thought to herself, that's unbelievable. Obviously I don't have any money to buy a blueberry muffin, but I'd sure like to. And he's a lawyer. And she decided, maybe I could be a lawyer. And you know that Allison Binney then started deciding, I got to get really serious about things if I want to be a lawyer. And she graduated from high school. She went to college. Then she went to Arizona State, became a lawyer. And she came to Washington, D.C., and she came to work for the Indian Affairs Select Committee. And then she became staff director of the Select Committee in Indian Affairs. Allison Binney, the guy with the blueberry muffin. And Allison Binney then became the person who, with me, developed an idea after I left the Congress, what can I do to be helpful to Native Americans? And my idea and hers was start with kids. Start with the children. That's the future. And so Allison Binney is now on the board of the Center for Native American Youth. This little girl grew up in poverty and was inspired by this man and her little bag and his little bag of blueberry muffins and her understanding that I could do that too. I could be a lawyer. And she's an extraordinary lawyer. And the reason I wanted to tell you that is her story's in this book as well. But I wanted to tell you that there are some really interesting stories about men and women, boys and girls in this book. Yeah, the book is The Girl in the Photograph, and Tamara, I can tell you, is doing much, much better. And God bless her for that. She's a resilient young woman and somebody I deeply admire. And her story is going to help other children, I think, on Indian reservations. But it's a book more than just Tamara's story. It's a book about a lot of really interesting, inspiring people that I wanted to write about so that you would know about them. And Dennis, thank you very much. I admire you and admire your bookstore, and thank all of you for coming today.